Hello, it is that time again. It is Wednesday at 1 o'clock. And I have a very special guest with me who will be joining momentarily. One of the originals of Washington State. Very, very talented young winemaker who's just taken over the reins at Andrew Will Winery. Will Camarda will be joining us as we speak about the wines of Washington and ultimately how he will carry the brand further into the future. So let's see if we can get him on the mic. Perfect. Let's see if we can get him here. There he is, Mr. Will Camarda. How are you, sir?
I like the intro music. You're right.
All right. Awesome. So, Will, if you could go ahead and actually introduce yourself to all the people out there who are not familiar with you or the winery. I know that Washington wines aren't necessarily as widely available in the UK and abroad. So please, if you could introduce yourself.
Yeah. So thanks for having me, Anthony. I just want to start off by saying I'm actually now the winemaker at Andrew Will Winery. My father, Chris Camarda, was actually one who originally started the winery. But I've now
That's fantastic. Awesome. So give us a little bit of history about the winery starting back in 1989.
Yeah, so 1989 was actually my father's first commercial vintage. Prior to that, he actually came from a background in the restaurant industry. He worked at a Italian bistro in the Pike Place Market. And sorry, hold on. No. Yeah, this works. And was doing the wine buying at the end for several years and really developed a palate, especially at the time for Bordeaux, for old world wines. So Bordeaux, Italian wines, a little bit of Burgundy. And, you know, I think what really triggered him to actually step into winemaking was having kind of even the first original boutique wineries. So Alex Glitz, the Quilceda Creeks, the Leonetti's, Woodward Canyons, you know, they were creating these really well-known wines that are actually starting to get press. And when he started trying them, he realized like, wow, you guys are making some killer wine over the mountains, and started taking it along. You know, he's still great friends with a lot of them, and kind of just took off from there.
Nice.
You know, we continued to produce the same kind of style of wines, honestly, that he started when he created. I mean, I've been lucky to actually try some of the original wines for his first vintage, which, you know, you could see what he wanted to do. I don't know if they have aged as gracefully as some of his more contemporary wines. But you could see right away, I think, in his early vintages that he knew what he wanted to do. He had a style. He wasn't in the mode of, I'm going to make 50 different wines from 30 varietals and see what sticks. He saw that Cab Franc, Merlot, Cabernet, those kind of classic Bordeaux varietals could really thrive in Washington. And from the beginning, focus purely on those. And that kind of hard, stead, you know, determination to learn as much as he could about those grapes in this climate, in this type of soil in Washington, proved to, I think, be a leading cause for his overall brand. I mean, Andrew Will Winery, yeah, we're small, but I give my dad a lot of credit. Is he has been cranking out high level wines for a very long time.
For sure.
Which is not always easy. Washington, yes, is a warm climate, but we do have vintage variation. We've had some really cold vintages. We've had some really hot wines. And even in the time that I've been there full time, I can see how, yes, those vintages do vary, but the same kind of quality, that balance, that freshness shows through in each of them, just albeit in different ways.
Sure. Awesome. Yeah, one of the most impactful experiences that I had last year in all of the wine tasting was connecting with you and your dad Chris at the winery on Vashon Island, and I don't know whose idea it was to bring out the 97 Sorella to put against the 96 Cos Eternal. But it was just spectacular, fireworks. When that happened, when the wine came out, and I'm looking at both labels, I literally immediately thought of the scene from American Psycho where they're all talking about business cards and, oh, this one's bone or this one's eggshell on charcoal on rhino skin. But then when they bring out that one business card, everyone takes their business cards off the table because they don't want to be compared. I thought, how is this going to play out? And when both bottles were opened and poured side by side, it was absolutely clear that Washington State can, in fact, make world-class wine that ages with some of the greatest wines of Bordeaux, and that are completely world-class. And it was very, very eye-opening just to see both those wines going on more than 20 years, and how beautiful they were, and how beautiful the Sorella specifically was. In my glass, I've got the 2017 that you recently submitted for review. So I've been nipping on that, and I'll be drinking some of that during the discussion. But yeah, talk to us about how you're doing in Washington, in Seattle, during this pandemic. I mean, Washington was really one of the first places to really get hit hard first, with northern Seattle going on full lockdown before really the rest of the nation. What does this mean for you and for the winery, and just overall, how are you doing?
I'm actually doing pretty good. I've had my ups and downs, like probably everyone during this. But for me, life and business kind of went on as usual. We're a small winery. I think we have 4 total employees there, and we all kind of do a little bit of everything. So it wasn't too big of a shift as far as day-to-day business. Obviously, the biggest thing is that our sales drastically shifted to a direct-to-consumer model.
Sure.
Prior to this whole coronavirus thing, we were looking at probably close to 55 to 60% distribution model, with focus on a lot of on-premise sales. Obviously, with restaurants closing down, that really changed how we had to sell wine. But because of our long-time brand recognition and a loyal fan base, we were able to maintain sales through online. People have been really supportive, both locally and around the country, which is great to see. Things like this can be definitely tougher on a smaller family independent run winery. But I give a lot of credit once again to my father, who, really was smart about how he ran his business as far as managing, finances, managing inventory, all those things that allow him to weather these type of storms. And it's made it a lot easier for me then to essentially take over then marketing and focusing on that, to help sell the wine, knowing that I don't have to worry so much about where the next, round of money is going to be to pay for bottles. Obviously, sure, it's not as smooth sailing as I would normally prefer. But I think
it is a global pandemic, so.
It is. And, and even for us, 10% of our wine now is actually sold globally.
That's great.
And that kind of stuff definitely shut it down. I mean, on top of the wine tariffs earlier in the year, which we all kind of thought was going to be, of course, the biggest story in wine, this has obviously even overshadowed that, which I stay in touch. I recently have contacted my distributors or wholesaler importers in Korea, the UK, Denmark. And it's a pretty similar story across the board. A lot of them, once again, are focused on on-premise accounts for our type of wines. And with that all being shut down, it's going to be a slow recovery on getting those sales back up.
Yeah, I mean, I have a feeling it's going to be kind of sluggish for a bit. But, that's one of the great things about this industry is that the wine industry produces alcohol, and alcohol will provide some level of comfort, even in the good times, even in the bad times. So it's something to look forward to, I suppose. Now that your dad, Chris, is kind of handed over the reins to you. Is there anything that you want to make more clear about the brand or want to set straight?
It would just be to kind of let everyone know that at this point, I really have taken on the full management side of production of winemaking. That being said, my dad's still very much a part of the winery. He lives on the property with the winery where I grew up still, and we talk almost every day when I go out there. I still will run everything by him as far as schedule, any kind of sales that are going through marketing stuff. I run it by him. He at this point has decided that, after 30 plus years, he's kind of just done with the day-to-day minutia of,
Yeah.
running all of that. But he loves wine. I mean, you still see it in his interest every time I bottle something or I'm racking. I mean, he wants to taste everything. He wants to know what's going on. And it kind of works out perfectly because I still have him there to bounce ideas off, to talk to do blending with.
Yeah.
But as far as, starting to really learn the business side of it, me taking over fully has been a really great thing. So yeah, at this point, I would say day to day, I'm running the winery. But that being said, like I said, there's always something to learn. And I'm, like I said, really blessed to have someone like that around to continue to teach me, because at the end of the day, I've really only been in this industry for a short while compared to a lot of the great winemakers out there.
Sure.
Yeah, it's exciting. But I don't plan on changing anything right away. I mean, as of now, like I said, I'm still learning. It's an endless world of knowledge. Let's put it that way. I'm
For
sure
sure.
you're very familiar with how much you can learn, and it's just essentially endless with the regions, the
Yeah.
styles, the
Yeah.
producers, and that's really what makes it interesting. But yeah, no, I'm excited to take over more and more. But like I said, at the end of the day, it's definitely fun being able to run that with my dad, which, at the end of the day, when I came on, I wasn't 100% sure how that would work out. Anytime
Yeah.
going into a business where you're seeing your
Anymore.
parents
Yeah.
5 to 6 days a week,
Yeah. For
it
sure.
could be, you tend to talk more candidly with your boss when he's, someone you spent the first 18 years of your
Yes.
life with. But we get along.
Fully
And I think,
understand.
and that's one of the things that's made, I think, the experience of coming back and working for a family business enjoyable for me is that relationship that I do share with that we still can go out and do things and combine that talk of wine in the things you like, whether it's watching football or playing golf. It's a pretty cool opportunity to have.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, Chris Camarda is one of those icons in Washington wine history, where uh, it's really impressive to see what he's created with the brand, and with you coming in and um, kind of taking over the day-to-day operations uh, at such a young age. You're incredibly talented, and I've tasted your most recent wines, and they're 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 beautiful. So I really look forward to watching your career over your lifetime, because you still have a long successful career ahead of you that undoubtedly will produce amazing things. So what do you essentially hope to achieve over your career in the world of winemaking for the next 20, 30, 40 years, however long?
Yeah. I think to continue to spread the brand. We do have a really great following. We're lucky to have distribution, like I said, globally. But I think there's more people out there who are curious about New World wines, especially the US and even more specifically Washington. As you said, the type of wines coming out of there, the quality has now gotten to a bar where it's no longer just a handful of producers. There's a wide swath of winemakers that are making really interesting and really high quality wines.
Mm.
And I want to be able to share that. I don't think it's just Andrew Will too that I'm excited about. I think it's being part of the Washington wine community that I'm also excited about spreading. But yeah, I mean, I think that'd be my mark, is to continue to, continue the legacy and spread the brand, and then hopefully have someone to take it over. Part of what's made this whole experience, like I was kind of talking about before, is being able to kind of take on a brand like this, not just being a family brand, but being something that was already established as one of the higher end wineries in the country. So it was really exciting. And I hope to, like I said, just continue what I'm doing. And like I said, meeting new people and just, spreading the good word on Andrew Will.
Yeah, awesome. So thinking about before you said, you're not gonna make any immediate changes right away. What changes would you consider in the future?
Absolutely. With Andrew Will, it really would come down to changes would just be is constantly looking at things like coopers, the types of barrels we're using, equipment, things like what temperatures we're fermenting at. I would think a lot of it would come down to actual wine making technique. As far as varietals go, I don't see a lot of change at Andrew Will. That being said, I am currently looking at ideally starting kind of a side project down the line when I get a little bit more time, and having the chance to play around with some different varietals. That's one of those parts of I guess my interest lies is seeing what else can grow in Washington well. We've proven that there's a really strong Rhone and Bordeaux program going here, but I think there's a lot of potential for Italian grapes, for Spanish grapes, for more similar but hardy style kind of grapes that can withstand the type of sunlight and heat that we get in Eastern Washington, as well as the dry conditions.
For sure.
So I think that's where I see myself going. Part two to that would be to kind of expand the second half of our winery, which I don't think many people actually really know about, but that would be our involuntary commitment brand.
Sure. That's made in Walla Walla, yes?
Yeah, we don't physically have any more space at the winery. It's a pretty small operation, so we're actually making it on an off-site facility, so around 2,400 cases. But the idea is taking essentially declassified fruit from vineyards that we own or work with, and putting it into kind of a little bit more of a value-priced bottling, but exhibiting the same qualities that we get in Andrew Will, using the same type of vinification. So native yeast, in this case, completely neutral French oak, and making wines that really over deliver, but at a standard retail price of around $20. I think there's a market out there for people who are willing to spend a little bit more money, but get a really truly handcrafted bottle of wine. And it's worked as a great introduction, I think, to Andrew Will wines. Around the country, it's been a giant driver, I think, actually, of Andrew Will sales in ways, because if I'm going to a store and I don't know anything about Washington or a wine shop, and someone is like, you should try this region, am I really going to go and drop $80 to $90 on maybe one of the higher end bottles of wines, not knowing what the wines are about, and I've never had one before? Probably not. But if someone offers me something in that $15 to $20 range and says,
more likely to take a chance on it.
Absolutely. And then once you try that and you see the quality, I think I personally would be much more intrigued to step up. I mean, I know from my own wine buying, that's a lot of times how I go on things, is I like to try some of the introductory wines and see there. Because if I see the quality in something that's kind of a second label, or, maybe on the lower side, I know that it's only going to get better from there on out. And, it can be a lot more, it can be less intimidating than dropping a little bit more cash on something a little bit nicer.
Yeah, I hear you on that. I have a rule of thumb whenever I go to a new Mexican food restaurant that I've never been to before.
Yeah.
I actually generally start by ordering a side of rice and a side of beans, because if they can't get that right, nothing else is going to be right.
Exactly. I love that analogy.
I completely understand that. There was a question earlier about was the average price of your wines, and where you are in the world, but they pretty much run from like 40 to 120-ish.
No, not, yeah. It depends. Yeah, I'd say at the high end, just the way I kind of gauge the average is,
40, 60.
Yeah, I think most of wines fall in that 40 to 60 kind of price point range. And like I said, we're only doing about 5,000 cases annually, with half of it being kind of on that 40 price dollar range, and the other half between that 60 and maybe $80 price range.
Yeah, awesome. So today it is a little hot in Napa. We've had this heat spike coming through. It was 99 yesterday.
Fun.
In Napa. And oddly enough, by Saturday, it's supposed to be down to the 60s and raining again. So climate change is real, for sure. How important is climate change to you, and what challenges do you foresee it giving you in the future?
I mean, the obvious thing is that it's going to continue to get warmer, and that's really going to change, when things start ripening, when we're harvesting, um, how compact or how stretched out the growing window is going to be. We can mitigate a lot of that, I think, right away in the vineyard based on watering, on vine positioning, on how much leafage you're taking off, how much, foliage you're taking off. That being said, there's also the part to global warming that we don't always associate right off the bat is the kind of the unpredictability, obviously, that global warming is putting on us.
Yeah,
Last year during harvest, we had two freezes in October. I mean, mid
mhm,
and kind of late October, which is unusual, especially being such a warm spring and summer leading into it. Those kind of colds are usually reserved for when you're getting closer to early November.
excuse me.
Yeah, of course. And that's kind of where I see actually global warming playing more of effect is kind of the unpredictability,
For
um,
sure.
you know, in the fall, probably when harvest hits. Uh, it's going to change everything for us. I think we're suited to not have a major issue, at least as far as Washington. We're obviously very dependent on snowpack because we do irrigate most vineyards irrigate. We get such little rain, anywhere
Yeah,
from 8 to 16 inches a year on average, I think, a lot of Eastern Washington.
yeah,
And it requires irrigation. And a lot of that water is coming from snowpack, melting snowpack throughout the summer. Um, like I said, that being said, we're taking things into consideration. I'm always talking to my vineyard managers about what type of, if we're going to replant, are there types of vines we should be looking at? Are there certain clones of varietals that we should be looking at that might do better in heat?
yeah, for sure.
And then paying attention to the people that are dealing with those kind of issues currently, places like California that are, going through right now. I mean, technically, you guys are going through one of the largest droughts,
It's
you
yeah,
know,
it's serious. Yeah,
um, and watching how you guys deal with it and hopefully take what we learned from you and start to apply it to us. Because, like I said, at this point, as someone with a geology background, so obviously a science-based background, I don't see
yeah.
any of this changing anytime soon. So,
Nor do I. This is why I think water rights are going to be a very important role moving forward for really all the West Coast, for California, Oregon, and Washington. Uh, really, really important. So what qualities do you look for in a wine during elevage when you're checking out how the wine is kind of rounding in the cellar through the barrels? What do you? I mean, is there something that you specifically look for, or your dad looks for, and then you kind of look at the same thing from two different perspectives, from two different sets of eyes?
yeah, what I'm really looking for is getting through. I mean, the first thing first is obviously for any winemaker is getting through primary fermentation safely. Um, and we are lucky that um, we work with vineyards with very high quality fruit. And we have the type of modern equipment that allows us to make sure that our wines go dry, usually in tank before we actually drain or press into barrel. Uh, you know, I tend to give wines a week or so after they're in barrel to kind of settle down before I taste them. But that initial tasting can be pretty important to me because, it's what you're starting with is obviously going to be harder to change as things go on. It's one of those things, if you start out with something that's got a good base to it, it's really just going to get more complex initially. Sorry, I have like a 30-second
Yeah, no worries.
task my ass wife has to do. I'll be right back.
No worries. The fun things of live broadcast.
Perfect.
So in my glass, I've got the 2017 Sorella coming from the Shampoo Vineyard of the Horse Seven Hills, uh, just submitted by Andrew Will Winery. Uh, really, really fantastic stuff. This is their top bottling, and a lot of love goes into it. So I'm just enjoying your 17 Sorella.
That's a nice little segue. Yeah, part of working at home obviously is when packages come and they need to be signed. you might as well do it since I'm here. It's
Right?
like this
Yeah,
is
I'm feverishly tasting through all the submissions that continually arrive. They've been arriving since May 2nd at a clip of about 50 to 60 a day or so. And yeah, this the very end of it. So this coming, was it tomorrow or Friday? Should be the last of the wines submitted. So yeah, I've been signing
you're busy.
away. I feel bad for my delivery drivers because we're on the second floor with no elevator, so they're having to huff all the cases up the stairs.
Yeah, and I think anyone in the wine industry knows too how strenuous that can get too after the first couple cases. It's a good workout. You feel good about yourself.
Right.
You start having to feel like you have to shift a whole pallet of wine back and forth all day during bottling or something like that. You're like, this is no longer fun or entertaining.
That's a workout. It builds character. So.
That's what I like to think about a lot of winemaking tasks. Actually, that's one of those things about just general winemaking that like friends of mine. It comes across on Instagram and in my stories that it's me tasting wine and kind of just hanging out and looking at barrels and walking through vineyards. But I don't know if you broadcast the 3 weeks straight that I'm standing on a bottling line, or working in the rain racking for a week. So like I said, they build character. Like
exactly. Yeah, just be thankful you're not riddling all day.
There's.
So what is do we finish the élevage question?
No. Like I said, the delivery guy kind of interrupted us there. What I'm looking for is just a solid wine out of the gate that I know feels like it has all the characteristics, just in a much rawer package. I'm making sure that the fruit's there, that it knows that it's already got a kind of sense of completeness early on, knowing that from there on, we don't do a lot of, if any, real manipulation once it gets through primary. We use, malolactic goes through on its own, and we'll do a couple rackings. We'll do a racking after ML finishes, and then we'll probably do 2 or 3 more rackings on the lifetime of a wine before it's bottled. We don't top off super judiciously on like a very 2-week schedule. We might top off once between racking, so we might go a month and a half without topping off. That being said, with the evaporation and everything, we still have a really good seal. And we like, we don't mind, we don't need our wines to be that, like, to have that kind of reduction. They're safe. We go through and do check them. I'm always going through barrels and making sure that everything tastes right. But for me, it's more about the wine doing its own thing. And that's what I'm really looking for at the end of the day is the wine changing or progressing? And it can be very subtle, and it can change. You can try wine 1 week, and the next week you can try wine from the exact same barrel, and you're like, this isn't where it's going to go. And then honestly, 2 months later, you go back, and it's the best wine you've ever made, kind of thing. That's part of wine that's so interesting and so fun, is how it changes. And it's not, like I said, these drastic changes where it's like, oh my gosh, this is terrible, this is great. It's these subtle things that you notice how it evolves. And then obviously the blending process for us, for a winery like ours, where our main focus on, especially our higher end wines, is that blending. Creating blends that we think will only get better as they age in barrel for the second half of their life, but accepting that they might change a little bit too. I think that's one thing I've learned from my dad, is that kind of, wine is a living thing and it's going to change. Trying to create this ideal thing, this ideal package, this ideal profile right away, and hopefully it'll never change, is obviously impossible. And we don't want it to stay the same. I think there's something about our wines that makes us interesting, is the ability that they do age really well. And during that aging process, they change, they morph. And that's what's, like I said, a lot of fun about getting to take over a winery that has that history, because I'm able to go back and actually see these essentially historical relics that are, not at all what they were like when they were probably bottled.
Yeah. That's the one thing about wine that is just always so mystifying to me, is that it is ultimately a living entity. And, in its youth, it shows, a certain way, and then in its maturity, it shows a certain way. And there's an elegance and a wisdom to certain wines as they mature. And not all wines are meant to age for more than a decade, but yeah, they for sure have personality and a life to them. So speaking of things that you've learned from your father, what is the most important lesson that you've learned from your father, Chris?
Uh, Most important lesson. Once again, I think it's kind of that minimal intervention winemaking style that, you be conscious of things, take care when you're measuring out the sulfur, whether you're figuring what blends are going together, how many barrels are going into the blend, making sure you're labeling the wine right. I mean, basic things like that. But at the same time, like I was kind of saying before, letting the wine do its thing. Don't, when you taste something that might be off, wait, come back. I see that sometimes in newer wineries, and sometimes in older ones, where you see this kind of heavy-handed approach where someone probably was overthinking the process.
Yeah.
And the wines show for it at the end of the day. I understand that making corrections to make something a product that you want to be satisfied does require some manipulation sometimes.
Yeah.
But at the same time, if you want something that's truly going to show the vine and the fruit, which is what we're all really aiming for, you kind of sometimes just have to let it go and trust the process.
Yeah.
And then the vineyard, I think my dad's, one of the things I've taken away from is kind of his steadfast belief and do what you want to do that you're going to be happy about. I think that's one of those traits that's had its ups and downs over the years, of kind of steadfast making wine that he wanted to drink at the dinner table at the end of the day. He never wanted to go down that route. And I think that was the artist in him of making wines based on a trend or a style. And at times you can kind of fall off the map. I mean, there's times where when trends change, and if you don't change with them, people kind of move on. And in the wine world, it moves quicker than most people kind of think as far as wine trends. But he was very steadfast in that, and it's paid off, because I think at the end of the day, we also have people that have had the wine and been buying the wines for 20 to 30 years and are probably pretty excited that they continue to buy them. They continue to trust his kind of steadfastness to trusting the process. And if I continue to make wines that I like, I'll be happy at the end of the day. I might not make as much money as I want to, but at the end of the day, I'll be proud of what I did. I think that's one of those things that makes selling the wine from the sales standpoint of my job really enjoyable. I'm selling something that I'm proud of, that, I used my hands to make, that, I was a part of.
It's awesome. Yeah, I completely understand what you're saying about having a heavy hand when a winemaker wants to push a style or a certain flavor profile in a certain direction. I agree. I think the wine will lose a certain sincerity to the wine. And yes, the wine may show glossy and shiny in its youth. The wines that really truly excite me are the wines that sometimes age the longest, and they have an identity to them that the wine over time will essentially remain true to that identity. So that's one thing that I've always enjoyed about Andrew Will wines is it's a style and a brand that you can kind of trust and count on to continually produce quality wines year after year after year. Was there ever a vintage that you know of that was declassified, that you said, where your dad said, quality's not there, we're not going to do it?
I don't believe from record of any vintages that he ever just tossed down the drain or decided, this wasn't going to work. I know he has favorites. There's definitely vintages that, I don't think he's as fond of. But I think still at the end of the day, I don't think he ever had a situation where he felt like this is not something that I'm proud of.
Yeah.
And like I said, that's just part of using that really consistent winemaking philosophy that, it's really then comes down to vintages. He's not, I did everything I could on my end to make a style of wine that I'm looking to. Mm-hmm. And I'm working with what the vintage gave me. And in some cases, it can be a little easier or not, depending. But I think they all have their own charm. I think
For sure.
I think the best example would be really at the end of the day are wines like 2010 and 11,
Yeah.
vintage wines from Washington, which out of the gate were not exactly, because it was so cold, they were not
Cold.
wines that were people rushing out the gate to buy. But I think most winemakers would say, especially in Washington, looking
Sleeper vintage.
back, that they're some of their favorite vintages. I mean, I've
Yeah.
had a bunch of 11s recently that are just phenomenal.
Stellar. Yeah.
And, comparing them even to something like 12, which was a much more consistent growing season, the type of vintage where everyone was making really good wine. Yes, it's also a great vintage. It's classic, but those 11s just have that kind of unique. There's something, maybe it's just the cooler, kind of vintage style wines. But when they age, they tend to change. I think more for the better over time. So that's kind of the fun part about that.
Yeah, I think 11, hands down, will go down as one of the great sleeper vintages for Washington, just because
Yep.
in the youth they weren't necessarily approachable, and if you're used to a certain style from a producer, the climate just didn't, the weather that year that just didn't give you what you really wanted. It gave you something else. You had to work with it, and you had to fight Mother Nature a little bit to basically work at that expression. And the acidity in those wines across the board, they're going to outlive most of the contemporaries of the surrounding vintages. So which of the bottlings that you work with gives you the most challenges, and what would you say is the most rewarding bottling to make?
So the wine that gives us the most challenges, it would probably, those are two parts. So the first would be essentially our white wines. Many people actually don't know, but we do have a small white wine program, currently focused on Sauvignon Blanc and Semillon. And because white's not a very big focus of our winery, I think this year we made only 200 cases of our Sauv Blanc. And it's not something that we do as regularly as reds on the same volume. There's a lot of things that go into it. It's a more delicate grape, the way, it reacts with oxygen. We ferment, obviously, in stainless steel barrel rather than temperature controlled tanks. It can definitely be a little bit more tricky. But when they come out well, our 18 Sauv Blanc, I was super excited about. It's one of those, like, when you hit big, it's pretty exciting. But when things go south, we've had some vintages of Viognier we've made in the past and some other fruit that the wines, I don't know what happened. Maybe I wasn't paying as much attention to them versus the reds, and, things kind of slid away, or I wasn't familiar with picking. I think it's another thing is obviously when you pick the whites without having as long a background with the vineyards, with the reds we do, you tend to be a little bit more in the dark of when you want to pick to create the type of wines you want, especially for kind of a young white program like ours. Another vineyard wine that we make, the Ciel du Cheval, is one that definitely can be a little bit harder to pinpoint, especially early on. One of the hottest, most growing day, most sunshine days sites. Yeah, most people know it as being a very warm place to grow wine. And they produce some very structured, brilliant wines, especially once they get a little bit of age on them. But in their youth, they can be a little rough around the edges. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it can be kind of hard when you're comparing it next to something like our two blondes vineyard blends, which have these really soft, fine-grained tannins. The floral nose comes out really early. And when you try them side by side, you're kind of like, uh-oh, why is this wine seem somewhat angular than the two blondes at the same age? And sometimes that structure, those tannins tend to stick around a little bit longer. And that's consistent, and that would say is probably one of the more challenging ones, just because, like I said, it could be harder to read, especially early on, even after bottling. The first year or two after bottling can be a little bit hard to read.
Sure.
As far as wines that I've been excited about, I think the past two vintages of Sorella have been brilliant. I think we've had the right type of weather. I think the fruit in that vineyard is at the right type of place.
Yeah.
And a lot of the 16, the 17s especially have really shined. Even 15, which was, again, one of those kind of hot vintages.
Mm-hmm.
It's still got this freshness to it that, once again, I think is always a testament. Going back, I'm going to give a lot of credit to my dad on all these questions. But creating those types of wines that, like I said, don't just follow the trend, in a hot year, well, the wine has to be hot. I don't think that's to be true. Yes, the alcohol might be a little bit higher, We might have had to pick a little bit riper, but they still always kind of retain that kind of freshness and that, like I said, the acid seems in balance and all the fruit and everything. And that's, I would say actually that the 15th Sorella is one of those wines that turned out, I think, really well. So yeah, I'm excited about that. And then, as I mentioned before, the involuntary commitment project. Like I said, the idea is to make a very $20 price point wine that drinks above its price. And I think we've done that even from the very first vintage, which was only 2016. It's exciting to work with a wine that has no new oak, to be completely honest. That being said, it doesn't mean that I'm going to turn Angel Well into a non-new oak house. I do think there's obviously something to be said about having those oak barrels and the way it helps wines age and the spices and the complexity they give off. But there's something to be said about drinking wines that are purely just the grape essentially in the bottle.
Yeah, have a purity to them.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you talk about the Sylve de Cheval. When looking at young red mountain wines, if you're not used to seeing a young red mountain wine, and say if you have like a California palate, if you take Napa Sonoma Cabernet and then you try Red Mountain Cabernet, you might your frame of reference will be off a little bit.
Exactly.
I always kind of get my frame of reference into looking at young Bordeaux, because young Bordeaux in its youth, I don't necessarily find pleasing. It's just rough around the edges, like you said. It will age beautifully, but it will take some time. So I kind of get my brain into that mode of, look at it from a mineral-driven, tannic, structured wine that is going to, kind of linger into the future. Because in its youth, those tannins stick out. It has that rusticity that kind of grinds on your gum line for a bit and weighs in your palate. That's a fair assessment. There was a question that popped up earlier. Do you have any wines available in Singapore?
We have sold some wines to Singapore. I think it's been a year or two since I can remember the last shipment going there. Mm-hmm. It's a company called Magnum. Okay. I think Magnum Limited is the company in Singapore that's had our wines. I've been in contact, obviously, at the end of last year about getting them some samples and trying some wines, but with everything going on, I think that's going to be delayed a little bit. But yeah, we do have representation in Singapore.
Awesome. Very good. Let's see. So as mainly a Bordeaux varietal house, you had mentioned looking into the possibility of some Italian varietals, some Spanish varietals. What do you think of the rising popularity of the Rhone varietals in Washington State overall?
I'm excited about it. I made 2 barrels of Grenache and 2 barrels of Syrah the last couple of years, which are exciting. But I'm excited to see a lot of the producers really go forward with that. I think it gives Washington another dimension, to be honest. And I think there's a lot of really interesting sites that we don't necessarily work with at Angel Will. But I've had the wines, and it's some pretty cool things coming out of those programs. I think Syrah, especially in Grenache, have some serious futures as far as, making a name for themselves as, varietals that stand out in Washington. And that's, once again, another part of what makes Washington so unique, is that because of the climate, we're not limited, and because of the regulations, admittedly, too, that we're not limited to a specific type of varietal or specific style of wine. There's a lot of experimentation, I think, going on still. And that's what you get from that, those kind of young regions where you don't have to just be known for Cabernet or Merlot. You can have blends, Syrahs that come out that are, that rival those. And I'm hoping we find some more varietals that stand out in the same way over time. I think that's just, once again, one of the beauties of having these kind of new regions is you can experiment. We're still figuring out things, where things grow well where. I think clonal selection is that topic that a lot of people are still working on, that we're figuring out if we change some clone selection up in some vineyards, will we get more interesting results. And you're seeing more kind of those mesoclimate, kind of smaller regions of Washington finding homes to varietals that might not normally be what you think of Washington. I think the Gorge would be one of the AVAs in Washington that, well, I don't make any wine from there. I've had a bunch of really interesting whites and kind of cooler climate reds that you might not be able to do, obviously, up on somewhere like Red Mountain or in the Horace Summit Hills.
For sure. Yeah, there's a lot of interesting things going on. I mean, Cabernet is outplanted Syrah about 4-1 in Washington, and Cabernet still continues to be kind of like the breadwinner for Washington State.
Yeah.
But yeah, I do see this dynamic shift of other varietals and people playing with certain varietals, and that's one of the great things about American winemaking is we're not confined by government restraints of what we can plant and where we can plant it, and it's about freedom. We can plant what we want where we want.
Exactly.
So with the shelter-in-place orders all over the world, what does this mean for your marketing and sales strategies, and how does this look for the future for Andrew Will Winery?
I think a lot of it is going to be working with distributors and coming up with ways to get the wines in front of people still. Prior to this, I was doing what most small wineries were doing is we're getting out on the road. I would have to say the biggest change was I was actually planning on probably being on the road, 3-4 days out of the week from early March through the end of June, visiting, essentially a different state every week. That means that's putting me in front of a lot of people, not just the sales reps and the managers that are selling my wine, but the stores, the restaurants, the wine dinners. For a winery like our size, I don't have a big advertising marketing budget. I have to rely on, kind of homemade newsletters and Instagram posts, which don't get me wrong, I think a giant boon, and I think a really important tool for small wineries. We can share a lot of information through these channels, and it's shown because I think people are truly still interested. I know it's not the same, obviously, as going out to the winery or your tasting room or the vineyards, and it never will be. But the fact that we can still stay connected in these ways and still continue to learn is pretty cool. And I think we're just going to have to adapt to that for the near future. I'm hoping that a lot of the restaurants that have carried our wines and a lot of Washington wines make it through all this. I know that's hopeful thinking that, it's all going to go back to normal, obviously. But I hope, a lot of that world, even with precautions and safety first, that we can still give back to the somm community, getting back to their job and be able to show people new wines. I mean, that's a lot of, I think what makes Andrew Will super unique at the end of the day too, is that we straddle that world of wine that's not on one side known for maybe its points and its trophiness, trophy characteristics, but it works in the food world, and that we have that type of respect between, the somm community as well as the general wine, just the general consumer community, which is also exciting. It's the type of that kind of type of consumer. You can drink it by itself and you can enjoy it even more with food. But
For
yeah,
sure.
no, it'll be interesting. Distributors, it's sorry there.
There's a bit of a lag there. I see. Awesome. You there?
Yeah, I'm here.
There we go. Okay, perfect. Awesome. You'd frozen on my screen for a little bit, but yeah. I find that Andrew wines are that you can enjoy just by themselves, but they are incredibly food friendly as well. It'll be interesting to see what happens with restaurants overall. In Napa here, just this past weekend, we had some restaurants open up, and it's been kind of touch and go, and yeah, we'll see how that goes. But yeah, there's been a few kind of pop-up questions throughout about being able to find your wines overseas. Do you have any information posted on your website?
It can be kind of limited. You could probably poke around and it might have some on there. As far as finding our wines in the US, I think it is listed somewhere that lists our distributors in each state. Mm-hmm. And then internationally, the best way, we don't have that. We only have 3. So we have Berry Brothers carry our wine in the UK, which is a great company. I mean, they've had the brand for a very long time, and it's really cool to be a part of a wine company that old with that kind of tradition.
For sure.
We're with a company called American Wine in Denmark, who I did a dinner there last year, which I think was in attendance like 142 people. I think it was the biggest wine dinner I've ever
Wow.
hosted or been a part of. And people were like legitimately excited to like learn, I think, about watching wine. I mean, the food was phenomenal. I think it was a Michelin star restaurant. The venue was amazing. And then throughout the EU, we have a company called Metis Imports that they actually represent us essentially throughout the entire EU, except mainland Denmark. So not a ton of wine makes it there, but we do have a pretty widespread distribution. At one point, kind of ending, we see your wines in the most like kind of random places over time. I think my dad was one of the most surprised once is when we were in Burgundy a few years ago, and one of his wines was actually in a wine shop there. I mean, we're talking
In Burgundy.
place, yeah, where what are the odds of that? But it's cool. I mean, one of the fun parts about this, like I said, and that's why I was talking about what I want to do with the winery and my brand and my goals is to get the wine in more hands around the world. I think there's something to be said about when I have friends who are like, I'm in Barcelona and I got to go down to their cellar and they have a bottle of Andrew Will and a bottle of Cayuse. And that's like the only American wine they had. I mean, it's not even like those are the only two American wines.
Really? So not even California, Oregon, or
so someone there obviously was probably a Washington fan, admittedly. But yeah, it's I think there's an interest out there. It's just getting the wines to the people, which is kind of our next step, and making sure the right people are in front of our wines explaining them.
For sure. Awesome. So do you have any parting thoughts or last words for us today?
Drink Washington wine. No, I just think people should know that, Andrew Will is, like I said, it's one of those brands that is not going anywhere. I'm really excited about the journey that I'm on with being the winemaker there. But also just that, I love meeting people. It's one of the parts of the jobs I have to admit I didn't sign up for when I started. I kind of came on thinking I'm just going to be in the winery. I'm going to be a cellar rat. I'm going to be just doing all the production. But when I got on the road and started meeting all the different types of people, whether it's sales reps or, wine directors, SOMs, store owners, that's really where I saw the world of wine being this larger thing than just grapes in a bottle. So like I said, I hope to meet a lot of the people who are hopefully listening and people that watch this eventually on my travels in person someday. I have a lot to learn. And like I said, I'd say half of my knowledge now is probably coming from the people I meet, not just from the winemaking side of it. And like I said, next step with everything would be is eventually I passed the WSET 3 last spring. And
congrats.
Awesome. Got a little distracted, so I couldn't jump into it this last fall. And with coronavirus, I don't think I'm going to put that on hold another year. But it is something that I would like to continue because, like I said, Washington wine's great. I think there's a lot of solid product, but I think we can only get better. And I think that's going to come from learning more about the other parts of the world, whether it's old regions or new, and really applying things that we continue to learn on Washington wines. But yeah, for those out there, I mean, Washington wine is probably some of the best value, I think, at least domestically, that you can probably find. And there's a lot of great small producers. I think it's a region that, like I said, has a ton of potential. You're probably going to hear from a bunch of other really great winemakers on this channel coming up, which I'm personally excited about hearing from. Even though I see these people in person, there's something still about hearing people, talk about these things in these kind of settings that you'll always learn something. And like I said, we're accessible. Being a small winery, I manage our social media accounts on top of, between racking barrels and trying to sell the wine. So if anyone ever has questions that didn't get answered here or want to answer, please just send us a message on one of our social media accounts, or, our website has our email. We try to answer everyone's questions, whether it's, should I drink the wine or how did you make the wine? Obviously, I could sit here for another hour or two talking even more in depthly, I'm sure, about the winemaking process and everything we do, but we're obviously a little bit limited on time and attention spans. But I just want to say thank you for hosting me, Andrew Will, for this, because like I said, it's a really great honor to be able to share kind of my story as a new winemaker, as well as kind of talk about, obviously all the work and the brand that my father built over there too.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for spending your afternoon with me on the Instagram live TV. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much. If you have any questions for Will or Andrew Will Winery, you can find them at Instagram at Andrew Will Winery, or you can go to the website. That does it for today. Please join me next week as I talk with another Washington winemaker. Should be really, really fun. I will be speaking with Christophe Baron of Cayuse fame and his other many different brands that he's built. Same time, Wednesday, 1 p.m. California time. I just want to say thank you again for spending your time with me today. Will, really, really
Of course.
great chats. Again, I look forward to all the great things you're going to achieve in your career. Very, very bright star. So thank you. And if you have any questions for me, for the viewers, you can find me at Sommelier Anthony Mueller, and also be active on the Instagram account for the Wine Advocate. So until next week, I bid you a cheers, stay safe, drink well, and be kind to others.
Good seeing you, Anthony.
Cheers, Will. Take care. Bye-bye.